The child on my operating table was 9 years old, and she was dying because I had run out of synthetic membrane on surgery 312. Her name was Pekka. A piece of jagged, white-hot shrapnel from a blown engine coupling had torn open her abdomen, shredding her lower filtration organ beyond anything my standard kit could fix. I was holding her arterial walls together with metal clamps that I had sanitized in sublight engine coolant because our primary sterilizer had gone dry 6 days ago. My hands were steady. After 400 consecutive surgeries over 11 sleepless days, my hands had ceased to belong to me, they were merely instruments executing mechanical survival. But steady hands cannot replace missing flesh. To keep her internal cavity sealed, I was packing the wound with strips of heavy cargo netting that my surgical nurse had boiled in the galley's last pot of clean water. I closed her up, stepped back, and let Nurse Athie take over the vital monitors. When I stepped out of the surgical bay, the stench hit me like a physical wall. The corridor outside was jammed with 900 people. They were sitting back to back against the cold bulkheads, lying across threshold seals, standing shoulder to shoulder in clusters so tight that moving through them required turning sideways. The air was thick, suffocating, soaked in the smell of unwashed bodies, gangrenous wounds, and the sharp, chemical tang of failing atmospheric scrubbers. Somewhere deeper down the main spine of the ship, children were crying. They had been crying for days, but the sound had changed. At first, it had been sharp, hysterical shrieks of terror. Now, it was a low, rhythmic, collective moan, the sound of young lives that had been terrified for so long that fear was no longer an emotion, it was simply their default state of existence. I stepped carefully over a young mother sleeping on the bare deck, her thin arms wrapped tightly around 2 trembling toddlers, and made my way toward the command section of the Sorrow's Reach. My vessel was a medical frigate. It had been designed by the Velhari High Command to comfortably hold 400 patients and a staff of 60. Right now, it was carrying 3,700 refugees, and every single one of them was either severely wounded, starving, or both. We were the 26th vessel in a panicked convoy of 42 ships, carrying the remaining 400,000 survivors of the Velhari species through unclaimed deep space. 19 days ago, the Grathak Dominion had made a formal declaration across galactic channels. The Velhari were a genetic aberration, an unneeded biological contaminant that required total erasure. They did not issue demands. They did not ask for territorial concessions or planetary tribute. They simply arrived in orbit with siege fleets and started burning worlds. The homeworld fell in 48 hours. Then the inner colonies. Then the border stations. 7 Velhari warships had escorted our refugee convoy to the Kethis Corridor border crossing. All 7 had been obliterated to buy us a brief 6-hour window of acceleration. Captain Thenis had intentionally rammed his crippled heavy cruiser into the Grathak flagship's main drive array just to scorch their pursuit path. I had served alongside Thenis for 12 years. I did not mourn him. I didn't have time. Mourning was a luxury reserved for people who had a tomorrow. 20 minutes later, a short-range shuttle dropped me off at the convoy's flagship, the Valiant Heart. Commander Rethus Vaughn had summoned what was left of the senior staff, which now meant anyone above the rank of lieutenant who was still breathing and capable of standing. 11 of us gathered around the central holotable. There should have been 40. Commander Vaughn looked like a ghost wrapped in a stained uniform. His graying skin had taken on that dull, papery quality that comes from severe malnutrition, and his eyes were hollowed out by a terrifying kind of exhaustion. He didn't bother with formal greetings or military protocol. He simply tapped the console, and our fleet's brutal reality appeared in bright, merciless red numbers. 14 ships in the convoy had critical drive failures. The heavy transport merchant's burden had lost its main reactor entirely and was being towed by an ore hauler that was itself running on 60% sublight capacity. The Whisper of Calm, an old grain carrier holding 9,000 civilians, was venting atmospheric pressure from a cracked hull seam that could rupture at any second. Our average speed had dropped by 18% over the last 48 hours, and it was decaying further with every passing hour. Behind us, at a distance of just 8 hours and closing, was the Grathak extermination fleet. 32 primary warships, including 4 planet-cracking siege platforms. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They knew we were bleeding out in the dark. Commander Vaughn looked up, his voice raspy. I have broadcast distress signals on every military, civilian, and diplomatic frequency in this quadrant since day one. Here are the official responses for the record. The Turai Compact, the largest military superpower in the sector, had replied on day 3. The conflict between the Grathak Dominion and the Velhari people is an internal territorial matter. The Compact will not intervene in the sovereign actions of a member state. The Selnari Federation had answered on day 5, we express our deepest moral concern and offer our thoughts of solidarity to the Velhari people during this difficult period. They offered no fuel, no medical supplies, no escort, and no sanctuary. The Galactic Council had not answered at all. 14 other regional governments had been spammed with our calls. 14 had deleted the transmissions without a word. Vaughn let the silence crush the room for a long moment before turning his tired eyes toward me. Fleet Surgeon Doss. If we force the remaining functional ships into emergency warp and abandon the failing transports, how many survive? I had already run the numbers on my datapad 3 times. Praying that my math was wrong. Less than half, I said flatly. And that assumes the towed ships don't disintegrate immediately under the initial warp pulse. If we jump right now, we immediately abandon 62,000 people to the Grathak forward scouts. No one in the room argued. Lieutenant Shev, a 23-year-old officer who had become our senior tactical commander simply because everyone senior to her was dead, began to cry silently. She didn't sob, tears just leaked down her face as she stood at rigid attention. Vaughn nodded slowly. Dismissed. Return to your stations. That was it. No motivational speech. No tactical miracle. We were going to be caught, and we were going to be slaughtered. The universe had listened to our screaming for 11 days and had answered with empty words of solidarity. I returned to the Sorrow's Reach, walked past the crowded corridors, and sat down at my desk. I opened a blank digital file. In 22 years of medical service, I had only ever sorted patients by medical urgency. But today, I began writing a different kind of list. A list of the patients who would receive our last remaining doses of sedatives so they wouldn't feel their flesh burn when the Grathak plasma charges breached the hull. And a list of those who would have to die screaming. I had typed 19 names when Nurse Athie burst into my office so hard the pneumatic door bounced off the wall. Surgeon, she gasped, her chest heaving. She was breathing so hard she couldn't stand straight. Someone answered. I stared at her, my pen hovering over the 19th name. What? A distress response, she whispered, her eyes wide with something terrifyingly close to panic. It didn't come on the official channels. It came through an ancient, decommissioned civilian relay network, the Neshik Deep Space Relay. It bounced through 11 dead stations before reaching our receiver. Which government? I demanded, my heart hammering against my ribs. The Compact? The Federation? Athie shook her head rapidly. No fleet registry. No government code. No species tag. Just 4 words translated into crude, low-tier Velhari trade speak. What 4 words, Athie? She looked at me, and her expression wasn't hope. Hope was a dangerous poison that we had burned out of our systems days ago. It was pure, unadulterated shock. Hold position. We are coming. I stood on the bridge of the flagship Valiant Heart less than 40 minutes later, squeezing into a narrow space against the back bulkhead. Nobody was speaking. The only sound in the cramped room was the low, crackling playback of the incoming transmission repeating for the 4th time through the central audio speakers. The voice did not belong to any species known to the regional charts. That much was immediately clear. It possessed a deep, heavy resonance in its lower frequencies that Velhari vocal cords were physically incapable of producing. The grammar was rough, and the speaker butchered our traditional consonant clusters with a hard, guttural accent, suggesting a throat structure built for raw power rather than melodic cadence. But despite the harshness, the 4 words cut through the static of the bridge with terrifying clarity: hold position. We are coming. Commander Vaughn leaned over the primary communications console, his hands gripping the metal edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. Run the vocal frequency analysis again. Sethri. Lieutenant Sethri, a young woman who had been a low-level communications analyst before the slaughter at the Kethis corridor, ran the diagnostic algorithms. Her fingers flew across the glass interface, pulling up acoustic wave models and comparative genetic databases. She stared at her screen, then looked up at Vaughn, then turned her eyes toward me as if looking for permission to read the data aloud. Species identification confirmed, Sethri said, her voice barely above a whisper. Terran Commonwealth. Species self-designation, human. Confidence level 98%. An unsettling, heavy silence fell over the bridge. I knew virtually nothing about humans. Most Velhari didn't. They were a young, isolated species that had achieved faster-than-light travel barely 2 centuries ago, operating out of a single, unremarkable star system on the far, wild fringe of the Orion Arm. They maintained a modest defense fleet, held no seats on the Galactic Mediation Council, and had shown absolute indifference to galactic political alliances since their initial contact 60 years prior. By every diplomatic, economic, and military metric that mattered, humanity was completely irrelevant. Lieutenant Commander Ferris, Vaughn's second-in-command, sneered as he stepped toward the table. This is a statistical absurdity. Earth is 6 days away from our current sector at theoretical maximum burn. Even if this Terran fleet launched the exact second our initial distress call went live, which they wouldn't have. Because their bureaucrats would need weeks to debate it, they couldn't possibly reach this sector before the Grathak Vanguard wipes us out. More importantly, Vaughn added, his face darkening. It might be a Grathak psyop. The Dominion has used spoofed distress responses before. They broadcast fake rescue signals to trick fleeing refugee fleets into dropping their sublight speed or changing course into kill zones. Sethri, can you trace the origin point of that relay bounce? Sethri tapped her console, pulling up a 3-dimensional tactical map of the local sector. A thin red line traced back through 11 abandoned communication buoys. The transmission path originates from the galactic west, Commander. The Grathak fleet is coming from the galactic north. The signal vector doesn't cross any known Grathak communication grids, but I cannot guarantee it hasn't been spoofed. I simply don't have the advanced decryptors required to verify military-grade signal masking. Vaughn stared at the red line for a long, agonizing minute. Then we treat it as a Grathak trap. Maintain current heading and acceleration. We do not slow down. We do not wait for ghost ships. I agreed with him. God help me, I agreed. Slowing down for a rescue that existed only as a ghost signal on a dead relay network was a quick way to commit suicide. 3 hours passed. I returned to the medical bay of the Sorrow's Reach. I treated 11 more critically injured refugees, lost 2 elderly patients to internal hemorrhaging, and was deep in the middle of a delicate chest reconstruction when Nurse Athie pulled back the sterile curtain once again. Second transmission, she said quietly. This one didn't come through the public relay. It hit our high-frequency military array. This message was drastically different. It arrived wrapped in a dense, multi-layered military encryption header, the kind of hyper-complex security protocol utilized exclusively by heavy dreadnoughts during fleet-level combat operations. It took Sethri and her entire communications team 11 full minutes to crack the outer shell. That detail alone was alarming. The Velhari Navy's absolute best encryption codes had never held off a hostile decryption sweep for more than 3 minutes. Whoever had constructed this signal possessed computational power that dwarfed our own. When the file finally unpacked, it didn't contain an audio message. It contained raw tactical data. It was a complete, high-resolution sensor sweep of the Gradhack pursuit fleet behind us. It listed the precise orbital vectors, hull signatures, reactor outputs, and weapon readiness states of all 32 Gradhack warships, updated to within 40 minutes of real time. The data was more accurate than anything our own damaged sensor arrays had produced since the war began. It even included a structural degradation analysis of our own 42 refugee ships, predicting drive failures across our fleet with a margin of error of less than 2%. Whoever sent the packet was watching us right now with long-range sensor tech that bypassed our electronic detection systems entirely. At the bottom of the data file was a single tactical instruction: reduce convoy speed by 12%. Adjust fleet heading 41 degrees spinward immediately. You will enter a dense metallic asteroid debris field in 20 minutes. The field will mask your thermal signatures for 90 minutes. Execute now. Back on the flagship bridge, tempers flared instantly. Ferris slammed his open hand against the console, his voice cracking with rage. It's a trap. They are explicitly commanding us to reduce our speed and bleed off our momentum. That is literally what the Gradhack have been trying to force us to do for a week. Sir, look at the sensor correlations. Sethri shouted back, pointing at the overlapping target tracks. The Gradhack fleet positions in this data packet are 100% accurate. Look at the flagship's thermal decay rate. If this is a fake transmission, whoever made it is feeding us live. Flawless intel on our enemy's real-time movements. Which is precisely what a high-level military deception would do to gain our trust. Ferris roared. Commander Vaughn stood motionless at the center of the bridge, silent. I watched his eyes. I had known Rethus Vaughn for 9 years, but I had never seen him look like this. He wasn't scared, he had burned past fear days ago. He was utterly paralyzed. For 11 days, he had been forced to make impossible choices, and every single choice had resulted in dead Velhari. Now, he was being ordered to alter the survival trajectory of 400,000 people based on a cryptic message from an obscure species, promising a physical impossibility. I stepped forward. I had no business speaking, I was a surgeon, not a tactical officer, but the math was screaming in my head. Commander, I said loudly, drawing the eyes of every officer on the bridge. 14 of our ships have failing drives. At our current speed, those 14 ships will break down completely within 5 hours. 4 of them are primary medical transports. If we maintain our current burn, those 60,000 people are dead anyway. Vaughn slowly turned his head toward me. And if we drop our speed? If we drop speed by 12%, the failing ships can equalize their reactor loads and stay with the fleet, I urged, leaning over the tactical map. We stay united. If this message is genuine, we gain 90 minutes of total thermal concealment. If it's a trap, we lose 40 minutes of our current lead time. Fragmentation is absolute death, Commander. Turning into the debris field is the only choice that leaves a window for survival. The bridge fell dead quiet. Ferris opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. The cold, brutal logic of the medical assessment left no room for debate. Vaughn took a deep breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. Helm. Adjust heading 41 degrees spinward. Reduce convoy speed by 12%. All ships, execute manual formation control. The convoy turned. 42 battered, scorched ships carrying the absolute last survivors of our civilization angled away from the open void and plunged directly into a chaotic, spinning storm of shattered space rock, all on the command of a stranger broadcasting from the far side of the galaxy. The asteroid field was a screaming hell of iron and ice. Rocks the size of residential towers tumbled through the darkness, tumbling blindly across our flight paths. Our automated collision sensors were completely useless, blinded by intense metallic dust clouds and radioactive interference. Every pilot in the fleet was forced to fly on raw, manual control, staring out through polarized viewports and swerving away from jagged rock faces by visual estimation alone. Inside the surgical bay of the Sorrow's Reach, the bulkheads groaned under constant stress. I leaned against an emergency strut, anchoring myself with one hand while keeping my other hand flat on little Pekka's chest monitor. Micrometeors pelted our outer hull like continuous machine gun fire, vibrating through the floor plates. 90 minutes. That was what the mysterious signal had promised. 90 agonizing minutes of flying blind through a graveyard of rock, unable to see the Grathack, and praying to whatever gods were left that the Grathack couldn't see us. I counted every single second. Every soul in the convoy did. When the flagship Valiant Heart finally cleared the edge of the dust cloud, Lieutenant Sethry's voice broadcast over the open fleet frequency, "The Grathack fleet has dropped out of pursuit formation. They lost our thermal signatures at the entry point of the debris field. They are fanning out into a wide search grid. They didn't follow us through." A collective gasp rippled through the fleet. 90 minutes, exactly as promised. The unknown voice had just bought 400,000 people an extra hour and a half of life, using nothing more than a localized sensor packet. I was still trying to wrap my mind around the tactical miracle when the third transmission hit our receivers. This was not a text file, nor was it a hidden data burst. It was an open, unencrypted fleet registry broadcast, the ancient, formal military protocol that sovereign warships transmit into a battle sector before engaging in unrestricted warfare. It was an explicit declaration of hostile intent, a warning to all vessels in the quadrant that heavily armed warships were entering the theater, and they were not coming to talk. The registry file displayed 18 distinct ship signatures. I didn't recognize a single class designation: Liberator class, Defiance class, Valor class. These were not names drawn from any standard military manual I had studied in the academy. But it was the name of the lead vessel at the top of the tactical list that made my heart stop: TCNS Harriet Tubman, Liberator class Dreadnought. I had no idea who Harriet Tubman was. I would learn much later. I would learn that she was an ancient human female who had lived centuries ago on their homeworld, a woman born into brutal chattel slavery who had escaped her captors. And then voluntarily returned again and again to the dark, lethal territory of her enslavers to guide hundreds of strangers to freedom. I would learn that humanity named their heavily armored war machines after individuals who had walked directly into hell for the sake of people they didn't know. But in that moment, standing on the deck of a dying medical ship, all I cared about was the structural class designation, Liberator. The word doesn't translate cleanly into the High Velhari tongue, but the core meaning was universally clear: the one who tears off your chains. On the bridge of the flagship, Commander Vaughn read the registry list, sat down heavily in his command chair, covered his face with both worn hands, and wept silently. Nobody on the bridge said a word. 6 hours had elapsed since that first cryptic forward message. 6 hours of excruciating terror while the Grathack slowly regrouped after losing us in the rocks. They had located our exit vector and were now burning their engines at emergency thresholds, closing the distance rapidly. 4 hours away. Then 3. I was aboard the Whisper of Calm, the damaged grain vessel with the cracking hull, helping my medical teams evacuate critical trauma patients from the compartments closest to the failing hull seals. The ship was literally falling apart around us. Every time the sublight engines pulsed, the metal deck plates shrieked, and I knew that if the main seal ruptured, the vacuum of space would flash freeze 9,000 people in seconds. We were moving as fast as physically possible, but we were desperately short on atmospheric shuttles. Without warning, every digital display screen on the ship flickered simultaneously. The cargo manifests, the engine output readouts, the emergency lighting panels, all went dark for a split second before snapping back on, overwritten by an incoming high-bandwidth visual feed. A face filled the screens. It was a human female. Her skin was a deep, rich brown, lined with heavy, sharp creases around her eyes and forehead. Her hair was short, silver gray, and cropped close to her skull. Her eyes possessed the terrifying, unshakable calm of a leader who had been making life-or-death decisions for so long that fear had been completely stripped from her psyche. She was standing on a warship bridge, but it was unlike any bridge I had ever seen. It was vast, stretching back into layered shadows, filled with glowing tactical holographic displays and dozens of human officers moving with absolute, cold precision. She spoke directly in formal, high-tier Velhari, not trade speak, but our native language, delivered with near-flawless grammatical structure. I would discover later that her ship's artificial intelligence had monitored our fleet's open communications over the previous 6 hours, analyzing our linguistic patterns and building a real-time translation module. "Commander Vaughn," she said, her voice echoing through every speaker in our fleet. "This is Rear Admiral Constance Okafor of the Terran Commonwealth Naval Strike Group 7. I am broadcasting on an open channel so that every soul in your convoy can hear me." She paused. It wasn't for dramatic effect, it was the calculated pause of an officer who valued absolute clarity. "My strike group consists of 18 warships. We are currently 4 hours from your position, inbound at maximum combat acceleration. We possess full tactical intelligence on the Grathak fleet pursuing you, including their array composition, firing ranges, armor specs, and command hierarchy. They possess 32 warships, including 4 heavy siege platforms. They outnumber us nearly 2 to 1, and on paper, they outgun us." She stated this brutal truth without a single twitch in her face. She was telling 400,000 desperate refugees that their rescuers were significantly outmatched, and she was doing it because she believed we deserved the cold, unvarnished truth. I respected her immensely for it. "I want to be entirely clear regarding our operational parameters," Admiral Okafor continued, her sharp eyes staring directly through the camera display. "We are not here to negotiate your safe passage. We are not here to broker a diplomatic ceasefire or mediate a territorial resolution with the Grathak Dominion. We are here for a single purpose, to place our hulls between your people and the enemy fleet, and to annihilate every hostile vessel that attempts to pass us. That is the only reason we are here." The injured child I was holding in my arms went completely still, her mouth open in shock. Around me in the narrow corridor, everyone stopped moving. Medical corpsmen carrying stretchers froze in place. People running down the ladders halted mid-step. Across 42 ships, 400,000 refugees held their breath at the exact same second. In our entire recorded history, no foreign power had ever fought for the Velhari. We were a peaceful, agrarian culture. We possessed no rare hyper-advanced technologies, no strategic military value, and no valuable mineral reserves. Every alliance we had ever pursued came with impossible economic conditions. And every plea for help we had ever sent into the galactic void had been answered with polite expressions of regret. And now, a species we barely knew existed, from a single star system on the far side of the galaxy, was telling us they were coming to throw themselves into a meat grinder for us, without demanding a single thing in return. Through the intership comms, I heard Commander Vaughn's cracked, emotional voice ask the question that was burning in every Velhari heart, "Admiral Okafor, why? We have no treaties with your Commonwealth. We have no trade agreements. We have nothing to give you. Why would your people bleed for us?" Admiral Okafor looked straight into the lens. There was no political calculation in her posture, no economic assessment, no hidden strategic agenda. "Because we picked up your distress signal, Commander," she said simply. "That is the only reason we have ever needed." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the corridor in total silence for 3 full seconds before it exploded into pure, chaotic noise. People collapsed to their knees, weeping uncontrollably. Others began screaming, not in terror, but in a strange, high-pitched vocalization that the Velhari throat only produces when a lifetime of suffocating grief is suddenly shattered by the impossible arrival of hope. A veteran soldier standing near me dropped his weapon, pressed his forehead against the cold deck, and sobbed into his hands. A woman grabbed my arm so hard her claws left deep bruises through my medical tunic, asking me over and over if this was real. Yes, I told her, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. It's real. Within 2 hours of that broadcast, Admiral Okafor's medical team transmitted a massive data file directly to every surgical bay in our fleet. It contained complete biological schematics, anatomical profiles, and chemical baseline tolerances for the human species. Okafor was preparing us. She fully expected her crews to take catastrophic casualties in the coming fight, and she wanted our medical staff ready to treat human bodies the moment the shooting stopped. I sat at my terminal on the Soros Reach, studying the human anatomical files while Nurse Athi prepped 3 additional operating tables. As a senior xenobiologist, what I read on those screens terrified me. Human biology was a bizarre, terrifying contradiction. By any objective galactic standard, they were shockingly fragile creatures. They possessed 0 redundant internal organs. If their single heart stopped or their primary liver failed, they died. Their outer skin had absolutely no natural resistance to ambient plasma radiation. Their bones, while dense, were brittle compared to our flexible cartilage systems. They possessed no biological thermal dampeners, no regenerative tissue capabilities. And their pain receptors were hypersensitive, triggering intense neurological distress at trauma levels that a Velhari soldier would easily push through. They bled rapidly. They infected easily. They were soft, breakable, organic machines hailing from a high-gravity death world that should have wiped them out 1,000,000 years ago. Yet, as I read deeper into their evolutionary history, I realized how they had survived that death world. They hadn't survived through thick armor plates or venomous claws, they had survived through sheer, terrifying, unreasonable stubbornness. When a human was broken, their mind possessed a bizarre neurochemical override mechanism that allowed them to keep moving, fighting, and screaming long after their physical frame had functionally died. "Surgeon," Athi said, holding up a glass vial. "Look at these chemical requirements. To synthesize a human-compatible blood substitute, we have to mix high-concentration iron salts with an organic compound we usually use for cleaning sublight engine manifolds. Then start mixing," I told her, stripping off my dirty gloves. "We are going to be treating soldiers who are coming to bleed for our children. I want every operating table stocked." The clock ticked down mercilessly. Okafor had been terrifyingly precise about her fleet's arrival time. Her strike group was burning their reactors at dangerous limits, aiming to intersect our flight path approximately 40 minutes before the Grathak fleet reached primary missile range of our convoy. 40 minutes. That was our entire margin for survival. If the human fleet was delayed by even 20 minutes due to engine strain, the Grathak vanguard would reach our trailing transports first, and there would be nothing to stop 4 planet-cracking siege platforms from reducing 9,000 refugees on the Whisper of Calm to space dust. I stood by the wide observation viewport on the upper deck of the Soros Reach, staring out into the black empty void. At precisely 14:02 fleet time, the space ahead of us ruptured. Our long-range sensors picked up 18 massive gravitational distortions as the human warships translated out of faster-than-light travel into real space. But these arrivals were unlike anything I had ever witnessed in 22 years of space travel. Standard FTL translation, utilized by every civilized species in the galaxy, was a delicate, highly regulated process. A ship would gradually bleed off velocity, smooth out its spatial displacement curve, and slide gracefully into normal space with a gentle blue flash of Cherenkov radiation. The humans didn't slide. They tore through. Their FTL drop signatures were violent, massive, and terrifyingly hot. Space-time itself seemed to scream as 18 massive steel holes ripped through the dimensional barrier, spewing superheated plasma flares and high-energy radiation bursts across thousands of kilometers. They arrived in a tight, hyper-aggressive combat spread, already moving at full attack speed, their primary weapon batteries fully powered. Their targeting arrays actively locking onto distant coordinates. They didn't arrive to deploy, they arrived in the middle of a battle stance. The first human vessel to slide past the Sorrow's reach was a small scout frigate. In any other navy, a frigate was a thin, lightly armored vessel designed for long-range reconnaissance. This human frigate was the size of a Velhari heavy cruiser. Its outer hull was painted a dull, matte charcoal gray, covered in jagged, unpolished weld scars, trophies of past battles that had been structurally repaired but never cosmetically smoothed over. And then came the TCNS Harriet Tubman. I thought I understood what a large warship looked like. I had seen Velhari battleships up close, and I had seen Grathak siege platforms on tactical sensors. I was wrong. The Harriet Tubman was not a ship. It was a floating, armored city that someone had strapped hyperdensity engines to and aimed at the throat of the universe. It completely blocked out the stars through my viewport. As it passed our medical ship at a distance of less than 3 kilometers, I could see individual hull plates, each one the size of a 5-story residential building. And every single light running along its massive superstructure was glowing a dark, dangerous, bloody red. Not the amber warning lights of standby mode. Not the calm blue lights of standard operations. Combat red. The color of an apex predator that had bared its teeth and intended to keep tearing until nothing left alive was standing in front of it. I pressed my palm against the cold viewport glass, feeling the heavy vibrational hum of the Dreadnought's massive sublight drives echoing through my own ship's deck plates. For the first time since our homeworld burned, I felt an emotion that wasn't terror, grief, or resignation. It was something primal, heavy, and terrifyingly vast. It was the feeling of standing in the pitch-black dark, hearing a massive, furious beast roaring in the shadows, and realizing for the very first time, that it wasn't roaring at you. It was roaring at the monsters trying to kill you. What happened next defied every single tactical doctrine taught in galactic military academies. Standard naval defense strategy was universally agreed upon across all star systems, when protecting a vulnerable, slow-moving civilian convoy against a numerically superior enemy. You form a tight defensive perimeter. You position your heavily armored ships around the transports, overlap your shield arrays, create a point defense umbrella, and force the attacker to come to you. You use your fixed position to funnel the enemy into concentrated kill zones. Admiral Okafor didn't set up a perimeter. The 18 human warships held their position in front of our convoy for less than 90 seconds, just long enough, I would later learn, for the Harriet Tubman's battle network to synchronize targeting computers across the strike group. Then, without a single word of warning, all 18 human warships ignited their main thrusters at full warburn and charged directly toward the Grathak fleet. They left us behind and attacked. On the bridge of the Sorrow's Reach, where I had returned because my surgical bay was fully prepared, Lieutenant Shev stared at the tactical display in absolute disbelief. They're abandoning the perimeter. They're accelerating directly into the Grathak center. The sensor readings were absurd. Mass of that scale should not have been capable of accelerating at those speeds. The thermal energy required to shove those massive steel dreadnoughts forward was beyond anything our engineering models thought physically possible. On the long-range display, the Grathak fleet was rapidly approaching, 32 primary warships arranged in a terrifying, sweeping pursuit wedge. The 4 massive siege platforms sat at the center, surrounded by heavy cruisers and screening destroyers. They had spent 11 days hunting defenseless civilians. They were set up for a slaughter, not a dogfight. The sudden, suicidal charge of 18 human warships broke their tactical coordination entirely. On the main holoscreen, we watched the Grathak formation waver. Their outer destroyer screens began fanning out to set up an encirclement maneuver. They outnumbered the humans almost 2-to-1. Their 4 siege platforms possessed enough raw firepower to glass a continent. By every mathematical calculation known to naval warfare, the human strike group was about to be surrounded and vaporized. The humans fired first. The Harriet Tubman's forward main battery discharged a single shot. Just one. Our bridge sensors registered the energy output of that single weapon discharge, and for 3 seconds, I assumed our sensor computer had suffered a fatal logic error. The energy reading spiked off the chart, a kinetic projection so absurdly massive it exceeded the total combined energy output of the entire Velhari Navy at its historical peak. The invisible kinetic slug crossed the void between the two fleets in less than 2 seconds. It struck the lead Grathak siege platform directly in its armored center. The platform, a 3-kilometer-wide floating fortress built to withstand orbital bombardment batteries and planetary defense lasers, split completely in half. A violent shockwave of expanding plasma and shattered metal bloomed across the tactical screen. The two severed halves of the massive siege platform tumbled away from each other, spilling thousands of tons of superheated atmosphere into the dark, crushing the Grathak destroyers flying beside it. The bridge of the Soros Reach fell into dead, terrifying silence. Lieutenant Shev stopped breathing. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the edge of the display console. One shot. A single kinetic round had snapped a planetary siege platform in two like a dry twig. And then, the remaining 17 human warships opened fire, and the tactical display turned into pure, unadulterated chaos. The humans did not fight in organized lines. They didn't maintain defensive formations, nor did they execute graceful, coordinated firing passes. They fought like pack-hunting predators. Each human warship picked a Grathak target, closed the distance to a suicidally close range, hit it with overwhelming kinetic and missile salvos. And then spun away on maneuvering thrusters before the surrounding enemy ships could bring their heavy guns to bear. They moved through the disciplined Grathak lines like rogue blades, cutting through the formation, isolating individual cruisers, tearing them apart. And immediately driving into the next layer of defenses. Through Sethri's communications array on the flagship, fragments of the human tactical channel leaked through our speakers. Their voices were terrifyingly calm. There was no screaming, no panic, no dramatic military posturing. They relayed target locks, hull breach reports, and reactor temperatures in the exact same cold, flat tone an engineer might use to read a routine diagnostic report. Strike Group, this is Tubman. Target Beta 3 shield stripped. Execute broadside. Tubman, this is Valor. Port armor belt breached in Sector 4. Internal fire contained. Continuing attack run. A human officer reported a catastrophic armor breach on his own ship with the exact same emotional weight as if he were reporting a blown light bulb. The Grathak, however, were screaming. Admiral Okafor's communications team was actively hacking the Grathak military channels and rebroadcasting their unencrypted panic directly to our convoy. It was a deliberate, psychological gift to 400,000 people who had spent 11 days being hunted like animals. She was letting us hear our executioners realize they were the prey. Break formation. Break formation. They're inside our shield umbrella. Target the Dreadnought. Why isn't its armor giving way? Fleet Command, we cannot lock onto their frigate. It's moving too fast. One transmission cut through the static with a raw, blood-curdling horror that I will never forget. A Grathak cruiser captain, his voice cracking with absolute terror, shrieked to his operational commander, "These are not warships. These are something else. These things are angry." He wasn't wrong. 30 minutes into the chaotic melee, the human fleet began taking severe damage. They were not invulnerable. A Grathak heavy battlecruiser managed to trap a human frigate, the TCNS Meridian, in a concentrated crossfire from 3 directions. A volley of heavy plasma torpedoes struck the frigate's stern section, completely blowing away its primary sublight engines. It was a fatal, catastrophic hit that would have instantly caused any Velhari crew to abandon ship. The Meridian didn't stop. Spinning wildly on emergency maneuvering thrusters, trailing white-hot debris and venting atmosphere from 5 different hull breaches, the shattered frigate kept fighting. As it tumbled through the void, its forward automated railguns continued firing with terrifying precision, slamming 4 consecutive kinetic slugs into the battlecruiser that had just crippled it. Until the massive Grathack vessel exploded into a cloud of expanding metal. I watched this unfold on the screen, and I finally understood the terrifying truth about human biology that no medical manual could capture. They didn't know how to yield. It wasn't a choice, it was a deep, biological flaw hard-coded into their evolutionary DNA. There was some primal, ancient wiring in their brains that simply refused to accept the reality of being beaten. The Meridian had lost half its physical mass, its engines were gone, and a third of its crew was dead, yet it was still maneuvering, still shooting. Still biting at the enemy's throat because the humans inside hadn't given themselves permission to die yet. And then, the medical shuttles began arriving at my ship. Surgeon. First transport incoming. Nurse Athie yelled, pulling me away from the tactical viewport. Human casualties. I ran to the primary bay. I had studied their anatomical files, synthesized their iron-based blood substitutes, and calibrated our surgical tools. I thought I was mentally prepared. I was wrong. The first human patient brought into my surgical bay was a young man, a weapons technician from the destroyer TCNS Defiance. His injuries were horrifying. He suffered second and third degree thermal burns across 40% of his body, his left arm was completely crushed from a collapsed bulkhead. And 3 jagged pieces of sharp metal shrapnel had torn open his abdomen. By any Velhari medical standard, his condition was absolute terminal trauma. A Velhari suffering these injuries would have gone into neurovascular shock and died 10 minutes ago. This human was wide awake. He lay on my operating table, his teeth clenched so hard his gums were bleeding, his body shuddering with agony. As I leaned over him with a scanner, he reached up with his uninjured right hand, grabbed my sleeve, and looked straight into my eyes. The transports, he rasped, his voice thick with blood. Did any of those bastards get past us? I stared at him in utter shock. No, I whispered. The convoy is safe. The battle is still 50 kilometers away. He released a long, shaky breath, his tense body relaxing slightly into the table. Good. Then get me patched up. I need to get back to my gun turret. He tried to sit up. This broken, breakable creature, whose internal cavity was open to the air, whose bones were shattered, and whose skin was charred, tried to physically drag himself off my operating table to go back into the void and fight. Hold him down. I screamed at my assistants. Inject 40 milligrams of nerve blocker now. I had to physically restrain him, pinning his shoulders against the table while Athie administered a high-dose sedative calibrated for human physiology. Even as his eyes rolled back and the drug pulled him under, his fingers were still twitching, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. His name was Danny Lim. He was 24 years old. He had traveled across millions of light-years of empty space to protect 400,000 strangers. And he nearly died on my table because he refused to stop fighting long enough to let me save his life. For 2 straight hours, I operated on Danny Lim. I adapted our field surgery techniques to seal his torn internal organs, set his fractured arm bone using heavy metallic pins designed for structural ship repair, and covered his burned flesh with specialized medical gels. I operated on 11 more human sailors that day. Every single one of them, without exception, asked about the safety of our refugee convoy before they asked about their own broken bodies. Every single one. Outside, the battle reached its brutal climax. The engagement lasted just over 2 hours. 11 Grathack warships were utterly destroyed, including 3 of their massive planet-cracking siege platforms. The humans lost 2 frigates, the Resolute and the Metork, and 4 heavy cruisers sustained structural damage so severe they were dead in the water. But throughout those 2 hours of brutal, point-blank slaughter, not a single Grathack warship ever managed to get 1 kilometer closer to our refugee convoy than they had been when the first shot was fired. The humans had drawn a line in the empty space with their own blood, and they had held it to the absolute inch. Then, the Grathack fleet broke. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a chaotic, terror-stricken rout. The remaining Gradhack vessels turned away from the human wall, burned their sublight engines to their absolute limits, and fled in every direction into the deep void. The humans didn't chase the fleeing ships. They let them run. Instead, their remaining battle-scarred cruisers swept through the debris, hunting down the 3 Gradhack destroyers that were still trying to maneuver toward our transports. And methodically vaporized them. Admiral Okafor's calm voice cut through the fleet-wide channel one final time, all Gradhack vessels. This is Rear Admiral Okafor. Any enemy vessel continuing on an intercept heading toward the Velhari convoy will be eliminated immediately. Any vessel withdrawing from this sector will not be pursued. You have 60 seconds to clear this battle space. 17 surviving Gradhack ships were still within range. 14 of them engaged their warp drives and vanished within 30 seconds. 3 did not. Perhaps their captains were religious zealots who couldn't accept defeat, or perhaps their communications arrays had been destroyed in the fighting. 60 seconds later, those 3 ships ceased to exist. I stood in my surgical bay, dripping with dark red human blood. It smelled sharply of iron, a metallic, bitter scent that was nothing like the sweet, copper smell of Velhari blood. My hands were stained red up to my wrists. Beside me, Nurse Athi broke down entirely, leaning her back against the bulkhead and sliding down to the floor, weeping violently into her apron. 2 of my junior surgical nurses dropped their tools and stood motionless, staring blankly at the deck plates as tears carved clean tracks through the dried blood on their faces. The tactical channels fell dead quiet. The sound of kinetic batteries had stopped. The Gradhack were gone. For the first time in 11 agonizing days, there was complete, absolute silence across our fleet. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of waiting for an executioner. Not the silence of despair. It was the quiet of a nightmare finally ending, a heavy, suffocating weight lifting off the chests of 400,000 people, leaving behind a strange, empty void that none of us knew how to fill. Because we had forgotten how to exist without terror. I looked down at my red-stained hands, then at young Danny Lim resting quietly on the operating table, his chest rising and falling in a smooth, sedated rhythm. I walked slowly over to the viewport and looked out at the stars. In the distance, the ruined hulls of 11 Gradhack warships were still glowing hot in the dark. Closer to us, 16 battered, scarred, battle-worn human warships were silently falling into a protective escort grid around our 42 refugee ships. Repair drones were already swarming over their damaged hulls, bright welding arcs flashing against the blackness of space. Their combat lights were still glowing red. They weren't leaving. They were staying. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, closed my eyes, and let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. 40 minutes after the final Gradhack warship fled the sector, Admiral Okafor established a direct line with Commander Vaughn. The conversation was broadcast across the entire fleet network, and I listened to it through the surgical bay speakers while finishing my post-op checks on the human patients. Okafor was completely direct. She informed Vaughn that Strike Group 7 would escort our damaged convoy to our final destination. Commander Vaughn paused for a long time before asking, his voice trembling, "Admiral, what destination? We have nowhere to go. No government has granted us asylum. No port will allow us to dock. We were a dying fleet of 400,000 refugees with no home, no territory, and no future." Surviving the Gradhack fleet hadn't solved the fundamental reality that our species was functionally extinct. Admiral Okafor's response was immediate. The Terran Commonwealth has formally granted the Velhari people full territorial settlement rights on 3 terraformed moons in the Cygnus Reach, a sector under Commonwealth jurisdiction. The moons possess breathable nitrogen-oxygen atmospheres, abundant fresh water, and pre-seeded agricultural land. Emergency housing facilities have already been constructed. A wave of shock rippled through the fleet. While the battle was being fought in the void, while human sailors were bleeding on my operating table, other humans on the ground in the Cygnus Reach had been working around the clock building homes. For our people. They had been adjusting door frames, modifying water filtration systems, and reconfiguring atmospheric ratios to match Velhari biology. They had started that construction before the battle was even fought, before they even knew if their own fleet would survive, simply because they had already decided that if we made it through the night, we were going to have a place to live. Commander Vaughn tried to speak twice, but his voice broke both times. When he finally managed to find his words, he choked out, "Admiral, on behalf of the Velhari people. We accept." The convoy adjusted its heading. For 3 days, our 42 battered refugee vessels flew alongside 16 heavily armored human warships. I spent those 3 days shuttling continuously between our fleet and the human dreadnought TCNS Harriet Tubman, assisting their chief medical officer, Dr. Philip Gosh, in treating the human wounded. Stepping onto the deck of the Harriet Tubman for the first time was an overwhelming experience. The corridors were vast, wide enough for 5 people to walk side by side, with soaring ceilings that seemed absurdly wasteful to a Velhari naval architect. The air was warm, humid, and carried a faint, rich scent that I eventually recognized as soil and living vegetation. The humans actually grew living plants inside their warships. Small, green, leafy earth plants were housed in glass compartments throughout the crew quarters, maintained for no strategic or tactical purpose other than the fact that humans simply liked having living things near them while they flew through the void. Everything about the human species was a bizarre contradiction. I walked past a mess hall where off-duty crew members were laughing, eating, and playing acoustic musical instruments, while in the very next compartment, 3 deck officers sat in absolute silence, weeping quietly as they catalogued the personal belongings of their dead crewmates. They carried immense grief and fierce joy in the exact same hands, seeing zero conflict between the two. On the second day, I met a human combat engineer named Grace Willoughby. She had a severe compound fracture in her left arm, secured in a temporary plastic splint. I found her in a narrow maintenance corridor, using her one good hand to drag thick power cables out of a wall junction. "Lieutenant," I said, stepping forward with my scanner. "You need to report to the medical deck immediately." She barely looked at me, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "Can't do it, Doc. This primary conduit feeds atmospheric scrubbers in Deck 7, that's where we're housing 300 of your evacuees from the grain carrier. The air gets thin down there if this line stays down." She refused to leave. I was forced to set her broken arm right there in the narrow, greasy corridor while she continued securing electrical cables with her free hand. When I finished bandaging her, she simply nodded, thanked me warmly, and went right back to work without missing a beat. On the 3rd day, I sat beside Danny Lim in the surgical bay of the Sorrow's Reach. His burns were healing remarkably well, and he was sitting up in bed, eating a bowl of synthetic broth. I finally asked him the question that had been burning in my heart since the day his fleet arrived. Not the diplomatic question Commander Vaughn had asked Admiral Okafor, but the real question. "Why, Danny?" I asked softly. "You are 24 years old. You are a low-ranking gunner. Why did you cross the galaxy to throw yourself into a meat grinder for people you had never seen? You almost died on my table. Why?" Danny set his spoon down and looked at me for a long time. His face was young, but his eyes possessed that heavy, ancient look that only comes from staring into the abyss. "About 400 years ago," Danny said quietly, "my species went through something similar to what your people just faced. Multiple times. Different eras, different continents, different names. But the exact same horror. Powerful groups decided that other human groups weren't real people, and they started slaughtering them systematically. We created words for it: genocide, ethnic cleansing, total eradication." He looked down at his bandaged hands. "We wrote those horror stories into our history books. We taught them to our children, and we swore a solemn oath, never again." He paused, a sad, bitter smile touching his lips. "We weren't very good at keeping that promise at first. We said it after the first atrocity, and then it happened again. We said it after the second, and it happened again. And eventually, my species realized something profound: never again is completely meaningless if it's just words on a piece of paper. He met my eyes, his voice dropping to a hard, unwavering pitch. It has to be an action. It has to be something you are willing to strap on armor and bleed for. So when your distress signal hit our receivers and we saw a peaceful culture being systematically exterminated, there was no debate. There was no political committee meeting to calculate economic trade benefits. Admiral Okafor took one look at the tactical feed and said, "Get Strike Group 7 ready." He leaned back against his pillows. Because the promise isn't never again for humans. The promise is never again for anyone. We might not be great at keeping promises with grand diplomatic speeches, Doc. But we are damn good at showing up. I sat in silence, unable to speak. What Danny Lim had just described wasn't a military strategy. It was a deep, ancient scar carved into the collective bone of his entire species, a scar that humanity had somehow converted into a moral compass. On the morning of the third day, we reached the Cygnus Reach. I was standing at the main viewport when the three moons came into view, floating like polished jewels against the dark curtain of space. A sound rippled through our convoy, a sound unlike anything I have ever heard in my life. It began on the forward transports where the view was clearest, and rolled backward through all 42 ships like a physical wave. It wasn't a military cheer, nor was it a loud cry. It was a massive, collective gasp drawn from the deepest part of 400,000 lungs, the sound a living soul makes when it finally realizes it doesn't have to die today. The moons were brilliant. Oceans of rich blue, sweeping continents of deep green, wrapped in thick clouds of breathable air. In orbit around the primary moon, dozens of massive human civilian transport ships were already moving, ferrying thousands of tons of medical supplies, agricultural machinery, and modular building units down to the surface. And as our medical frigate drew closer, I could see clear outlines on the ground, long paved roads, water processing facilities, medical centers, and thousands of prefabricated housing structures, all built by human hands for a people they had never met. On the landing fields near the main settlement, someone had planted rows of native Velhari Gra flowers. I don't know how they sourced the seeds from our burning homeworld. I don't know how they knew what those purple flowers meant to our culture. But when the first shuttle touched down and the first group of Velhari refugees stepped off the ramp onto solid ground, they walked through a sea of blooming purple petals. That detail broke me completely. The children were the ones who made me lose all professional composure. Children who had been confined to dark, stinking ship corridors for weeks, children who had forgotten what a horizon looked like, were pressing their small faces against every viewport, making high-pitched, joyous shrieks that I hadn't heard since the war began. They were pointing at the clouds, the green fields, and the endless blue sky. I walked down the landing ramp of the Soros Reach on legs that felt wobbly and strange after weeks in artificial ship gravity. The planetary air hit my face first. It was warm, rich, and fresh, carrying the sweet smell of rich soil, damp grass, and wild rivers. Real wind blew across my skin. A young human officer was standing at the base of the ramp, a heavy medical kit slung over his shoulder. He straightened his uniform when he saw my surgeon's insignia, stepped forward, and asked in careful, accented Velhari, "Do you require immediate medical assistance, doctor?" I looked past him. I looked at the bustling settlement stretching across the valley. I saw heavy human construction workers lifting Velhari toddlers who were too weak to walk, holding them gently against their dense, armored chests as they carried them toward warm medical tents. I looked at the purple Gra flowers swaying gently in the breeze. And then, off to the side of the main housing block, I saw something that made my chest tighten. They were building a school. Before the housing units were fully completed, before the agricultural fields were harvested, before the administrative centers were built, human engineers were actively framing a school for Velhari children. As if the most urgent, non-negotiable priority in the entire universe was ensuring that our children would have a place to learn tomorrow. I turned back to the young human officer. He was watching me with a quiet, patient expression, the look of a species that did things not because it was easy, strategic, or profitable, but simply because it was right. I spoke a single word to him, in his language, not mine. "You came," I whispered. The young soldier smiled softly, tapping his medical kit. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We did." I stood there in the warm sunlight, on a world that wasn't mine, given to us by strangers who owed us nothing, and I wept. I didn't try to hide my tears. I didn't turn away. I stood in the open air and let the grief and relief wash through me, because after 11 days of counting the dying and holding my breath in the dark, I had finally earned the right to fall apart. Later that evening, after the first wave of trauma patients had been settled into ground medical tents, a human nurse named Lena sat beside me on a wooden crate outside the field clinic. She saw me struggling to write in my journal, trying to find a word in the human language that captured what had happened to us. "Gratitude?" Lena offered gently. "Is that the word you're looking for?" I shook my head slowly. "No. Gratitude is too small. It's the overwhelming feeling of discovering that the universe isn't cold and empty after all. We believed no one was listening. We believed the void was dead. And your people filled it." Lena looked out over the quiet settlement, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening twilight. "Maybe the word you're looking for is faith." "Faith in what?" I asked. "In gods. In military power. Faith in each other," she said softly. "The unreasonable belief that somewhere in the dark, someone is listening. And if you scream loud enough, someone will come." The Velhari language didn't have a word for that exact concept. We had words for hope, the passive wish that circumstances might improve. We had words for trust, the logical expectation that a contract would be honored. But we had no word for the fierce, dangerous, unreasonable conviction that a complete stranger would cross a dark galaxy to fight off your executioners simply because you asked for help. We have that word now. I learned it from a species that builds schools before finishing houses. I learned it from a species that names its colossal warships after historical slaves who walked back into danger to free strangers. I learned it from young Danny Lim, who tried to drag his broken body off an operating table to protect children he had never met. I will teach that word to every Velhari child who grows up on these 3 green moons, under this bright sun, in the homes that human hands built and the schools that human hearts demanded. I will teach them the word, I will teach them what it cost, and I will make sure they never forget that on the darkest night of our history, when the galaxy turned its back. When our fleet was 8 hours from total extinction, and the void was dead silent. Someone answered. Someone came howling from the void, and they carried us home.